Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on mergers and acquisitions and retaining key talent. My name is Frank Jenert and I'll be moderating our discussion today, exploring many of the executive compensation-related concerns the board faces when undergoing a transaction. Perhaps surprisingly, given the past year, M&A activity remains strong. For companies with a deal on the horizon, and even for those where a deal is perhaps just a future possibility, understanding ChangeinControl provisions is a must. I'm joined today by two experts in this field, Margaret Black and Dan Wetzel, both managing directors in Pearl Meyer's Los Angeles office. They have decades of experience advising companies on critical legal and tax issues related to ChangeinControl contracts. They're going to share with us some common ChangeinControl plans, designs, and features, as well as how to structure potential retention and/or transaction bonuses. Before we get started, Sienna Brin with the NACD education team will cover a short list of housekeeping items. Sienna?
Thank you very much, Frank. As Frank just said, we have a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started. First, I'll talk about the tools you have available in your webinar console. In the top right corner of your webinar console, you can submit a question to be answered by our speakers during the program, time permitting. Please note that if you submit a question, you will be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from Pearl Meyer. And in the bottom right corner, you can download a copy of today's slide deck and access additional resources. Today's slide deck is also available on pearlmeyer.com at the URL on your screen. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available early next week at both nacdonline.org and pearlmeyer.com. Your participation in today's live webinar earns you credit toward maintaining your NACD credential. NACD fellows will automatically receive 1 skill credit for their participation, and certified directors will automatically receive 1 recertification credit for participating. Please note that you must attend this webinar for at least 50 minutes in order to receive either credit. Finally, we will have a few anonymous evaluation questions at the very end of the program, and we would really appreciate your feedback, so please stick around at the end of the webcast to answer those questions. And that sums up our housekeeping announcements. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Frank to get us started.
Thanks, Sienna. So let's kick this off. Maybe before we go into the details of ChangeinControl agreements, maybe Dan, if you could help us understand what is a ChangeinControl agreement and when and why do companies put this in place?
Great, thanks, Frank. And we'd like to thank NACD for the chance to talk about these issues and topics today. ChangeinControl. So ChangeinControl agreements are a lot like severance in that they compensate executives for a job loss. The difference being, in this case, it's really related to a change of control. So it generally includes, items like severance, continuation of benefits, and the treatment of equity. It differs from severance in that severance is really intended to act as a bridge payment for future employment at a termination event, and that usually occurs, due to performance or maybe because there's a change in the company strategy that results in the loss of the job. Whereas in a change of control, it's really our top talent that's being affected, and they are having a lead time of 3 or 6 or 9 months when the deal's announced or when they find out about the deal to knowing that they might lose their job. And that gives them the opportunity to start looking for their next career opportunity. So as a result, the values in the CIC potential payments are usually, higher than they are in a severance situation because it acts to mitigate that conflict of interest of looking for a job. It acts as a retention tool basically through the, the up until and even post change of control, and it protects shareholder value. And there are a number of vehicles that, sort of fall within that, whether it's cash severance or equity, general benefits programs, or retention or transaction pay. So on our agenda today, I think we really have sort of 3 main points that we'd like to cover. And the first is as it relates to a little bit of time we're going to spend on typical plan provisions when a company is not considering, a change in control, but really just, operating on a steady state basis. The bulk of the discussion today is really focused on what actions, should the seller take in the event of an imminent change in control, and how should, management and the board evaluate the reasonableness and applicability of those types of changes. And then last, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key, legal and tax issues related to payments that are contingent on the change in control. So, Margaret, why don't we kick off on talking about what kind of the current state of the environment is?
Sure, thanks, Dan. So we have gathered information on public companies, the Russell 3000, through our sister company, Main Data Group. The benefits generally vary based on industry and size of the organization, but generally what we have on the slide is reflective of what is disclosed in the aggregate annually. It's all gathered from annual disclosures as part of the change in control and post-termination section of the proxy to the NEOs. So this is NEO data. In the case of cash severance, 75 to 80% of the companies typically have already put in place cash severance before a change in control is imminent. The benefits are, for the most part, double trigger benefits, which mean it requires, both the change in control and the termination to be payable. Equity treatment upon a change in control is nearly universal. The prevalence of double trigger awards far outnumbers single trigger benefits, where only a change of control would be required. Single trigger benefits on equity used to be the norm. The vast majority of companies provide for full acceleration of time-based awards like options, restricted stock, RSUs. PSUs are a little trickier. Generally, the plan or the individual award agreement would provide for a target payout or target or actual payout in some fashion. Target is the most prevalent approach. The majority are full vesting, but some, well, for PSUs is a little trickier. The plan or award agreements typically also provide for that, as I mentioned, the target payout, but the majority are full vesting, but there is some prorated vesting. The next kind of most common benefit we see is what companies are doing about the current year bonus. The majority of those provide for prorated payouts, and that's because it's often a component of the change in control severance program. Benefits continuation is somewhat less prevalent than the other benefits mentioned above. 66% of the companies indicated they were providing benefits continuation. The most common benefit continuation periods being 18, 24, 36 months. Typically that benefit continuation period it often mirrors the severance period. Turn to the next slide, please, Dan.
So, Margaret, may I just ask a follow-up question here? You said, if I heard you correctly, between 70 and 75% of the companies already have change in control agreements, even if there is no deal on the horizon. Is this basically for public companies, or do you see the same in private equity-owned companies or in private companies? So that's one question. And then the other question is, if there's no deal on the horizon, but 70 to 75% of the companies have it already, is it something what's almost like a standard and it's expected by key executives to have as part of their compensation package?
Well, I was thinking that, from the standpoint of public companies, it is pretty much the norm to have a change in control agreement for senior executives, and it's nearly universal on the equity, right? Which is a broader participant group. In private companies, it's a little bit different in that, if you're looking, and it really depends on the investor. So if we're looking at private equity, they have a liquidation strategy for their investment, and as a result of that, it's going to be very common that they're going to have, some sort of a change control provision on the equity. By the nature of private equity, they tend to have, more narrowed view and approach as it relates to who participates and who's critical to the organization. So they may have fewer individuals that would be covered under a cash severance program, but still be pretty common. And then, of course, if the company is not, it's a family-owned business and not really anticipating any future, change of control, then, the prevalence, would fall quite a bit. So is that your experience as well, Frank?
Yes, absolutely. That's why I asked the question, because, in all the companies I'm on the board of and where I was CEO, it's to be expected. And it doesn't surprise me that you say in private equity, it's also very common because that's a playbook. After a couple of years, they have to sell it to somebody else, and they want to make sure that they maintain the management team during this phase. I just got a question here from the audience, and the question was, what is a double trigger?
Good question. Double trigger means that there are two contingencies. One is the change in control, and the other is termination required. So hence the double in the trigger. So for example, in severance, a change in control happens and also termination is required, as opposed to single trigger. Single trigger means essentially it's payable as a result of the change in control only, so hence the single trigger name.
So how about, the executive transitions to the new company in a double trigger situation and is not terminated, but has a job which is significantly below the prior job. Let's say before, person was CEO, now is vice president marketing. Would this be a double trigger, even though the person has not been terminated and maybe voluntarily leaves the company? How would this work?
Dan, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. I think so. There's a lot of provisions as it relates to a change in control agreement, which specifies that it's a termination without cause. But there's also a clause in many of these agreements which is quote for good reason. So an executive can terminate voluntarily if certain things occur under this clause of good reason, and one of those would be a reduction in their responsibilities. Another would be a reduction in their pay. And then there might be others that would be, related to if a acquiring company is asking, the executive to move more than 35 or 40 miles away from where they work today. So there's a number of those provisions, and under those circumstances, the executive would basically be able to leave, and they'd be able to receive the benefit if those criteria are met.
Okay, perfect.
Great. So let's, Margaret, you want to cover kind of the severance levels?
Certainly. So this chart is breaking down the amount of cash severance payable to the CEOs by the revenue size of the company. The smallest companies are on the left and the largest companies are on the right. The categories we have specified are less than 100 million in revenues, 100 to 500 million, 500 million to a billion to 10 billion, and then over 10 billion. So the most common approach is to provide for a multiple of salary or a multiple of salary plus bonus as the basis for severance. And as you can see in the lower table, the majority of the companies use a CEO's salary plus target bonus to determine severance. Although in the smaller companies, there are a minority of companies that calculate severance based on salary alone. So what the upper chart shows is that among the larger companies, the vast majority are using a multiple of 2 to 3x salary and bonus. But when you look at the smaller companies category, there's greater variability with companies roughly split between, the various multiples of less than 1.5x, 1.5 to 2, 2 to 2.5, and for those providing a 3x multiple. We don't break it out here, but we do suspect that some of those higher multiples are likely correlated to the companies which provide a salary-only approach. Next slide. Okay, so these sorry about that. So these tables are reflective, similar information that we just saw on the CEO slide, but here we added a cut of the companies which provide less than 1x multiple of severance. Similar to the CEOs, the larger companies are tending to provide a multiple that is 2 to 3x salary and bonus. The smaller companies, the most common multiple is the 1 to 1.5x, although there is a great deal of variation with those smaller companies. You can also see that this data covers the severance. Our data covers the severance for each NEO. It's not an aggregation by company. And we have found, in our experience that there are differences among NEOs on the multiple provided. So in the smaller companies, we might expect that the more senior positions, such as maybe like president or the chief operating officer, would have the higher multiples, with the lower multiples going to the other executives. So let's move on now to what happens when a change in control is imminent.
Margaret,
yes?
A question here. You talked about NEOs, named executive officers, that basically the top 5 executives in the company by pay, but also you talked about some other people who might be getting it. What are some examples for people who might be getting it? Is this people who are important for the deal and you don't want to lose them? Let's say somebody who works in corporate development, or what are some of those people who are not NEOs who would be getting this?
Well, just to be clear, our data, the data that we just presented, covers NEOs only because it's based on the annual proxy disclosures. So our data is covering NEOs. As far as other executives, typically, and Dan, you can put your 2 cents in, but typically change control agreements typically cover the sort of senior level executives. So, and it goes in tiers from CEO reports down to other senior levels.
So then basically, if you have another important employee who is not a C-level executive, maybe you deal with it through a retention package and say, you know what, we need you to stay through the deal. And, and we're not sure if you get a job afterwards with the acquirer, but here's a retention bonus of X in cash, and, just to incentivize you not to leave the company.
Yeah, that's a very good segue into our next slide.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, typically when we're not talking about an imminent deal, right, it's the CEO, direct reports, maybe one level below that get covered, and the amounts, can go down to as little as, maybe 6 months severance or 9 months severance in the change of control provision. But then we get into the next stage, which is what happens when there's actually a deal, right? And that's really the key here, is that first and foremost, the priority for the company is to retain selective talent, and the impact of a change in control is, can be quite variable, right? I mean, it certainly is going to likely affect the senior management, but it might also affect somebody, as you had mentioned, like corporate development, or BU heads in a particular area, or some of the functional units who wouldn't necessarily be covered under a change in control agreement. So for purposes of the board and management, one of the key issues is really understanding what the current arrangements are and what the potential impact is, as well as what the perceived impact is, and then adjusting and amending those outstanding arrangements. Maybe that's adding a change in control provision, maybe it's adding a retention bonus, maybe it's putting in a transaction bonus, maybe it's enhancing severance. There's a variety of alternatives there. And then, so getting that reviewed, assessed, and approved is sort of the first couple of steps from a seller's perspective. And then after that, we've got to communicate this effectively, right? And really to keep people focused on the task at hand, which is the continuation of the business on an ongoing basis.
Just a quick question from the audience, and I think you can answer this very quick. A severance agreement in many cases has a non-compete element attached to it. Is this the same for a change in control agreement?
It is pretty typical to have a non-compete or a non-solicit attached to the change in control. Obviously, it depends on the state, because there are certain states who view it as something against public policy, and others that are more flexible on that. And there's others that sort of have a perspective about sort of the allowable time frame associated with a non-compete. But it would be fairly common to have a non-compete attached to most of these. Obviously, as you get further down within the organization, then in some cases there really would not be that same provision.
Okay, so
Margaret, do you want to talk a little bit about tools?
Yeah, sure. So companies will have had a number of arrangements already in place prior to the change of control to keep talent through the closing. As we've mentioned many times, we commonly see change of control severance agreements covering senior management, the top of the house, so to speak. Most companies will have the equity awards, and generally, whether they are assumed or not, the awards will vest upon the change of control or after change of control and a subsequent job loss. So these act as another retention tool. In addition, companies would also likely have some type of broad-based severance or benefits that would be payable upon termination or after a change of control and subsequent termination. These severance benefits provide some retentive value since executives would know that they would be protected in the event of a job loss. The last two categories on here we have as our tools to consider are retention and transaction pay. These can be implemented during a change of control or sort of, when a change of control is imminent to encourage retention for a select group of employees so that they remain with the company through and shortly following the change of control. I guess we should define the two terms here. There's really no hard and fast definitions, and people sort of use the terms loosely because transaction bonuses can have some retentive value as well. But we define ourselves retention pay either as cash or equity as a payment that would occur over a fixed amount of time, and for purposes of a change of control, it would be a payment that is not expected to be fully paid until at least 6 months after the close of the deal. We define transaction bonuses as any payment that would be contingent on the change of control and fully paid either at the change of control or very, very shortly thereafter. Transaction bonuses generally occur only in the event of a change of control or spin-off of a subsidiary organization. Next slide.
There's a question, Margaret, from the audience again. How about Serps, supplemental executive retirement plans? Are they also being considered in change of control agreements?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. We haven't put it on the slides, but we do often see vesting of supplemental executive retirement plans with companies who have these types of programs. As you know, the prevalence of Serps themselves, defined benefit Serps, are, it's a lower prevalence than it has been in past decades. And typically we see those more often at sort of the larger companies that have, these type of defined benefit plans, for the broad-based company. We also see Serps that are defined contribution Serps. But yes, Serps vesting upon the changing control, we do see that commonly.
Okay, great. And a follow-on question also from the audience. And so originally we thought we keep the questions to the end and reserve 15 minutes, but I think it's appropriate to address them as they come up when you talk about a certain topic. So I just want to address this as well here. So there was a question about who determines, if you go back to the prior slide, who determines the amount of what's being paid. What happens to stock options, what happens to Serps, what happens to cash and bonus and so forth. Who determines this? And the question was, do the consultants steer this, or does the board of directors steer this? And I'll take a stab at this as a board member, and then I'll let Pearl Meyer answer and give us their view. So as a board member, what you do, first you look at what's common, what do peers pay? So because you have to be competitive. It's the same as with salary and bonus and equity. You always look at companies similar size, similar industry, and you look what's competitive, because you want to be competitive. Executives expect a change in control agreements nowadays. And the second is, of course, you typically have a compensation consultant like Pearl Meyer, and you ask them, what are the latest trends and what is reasonable. And then as a board, you sit down and you discuss this. You take all the inputs you get from peers and from the consultants, and you ask what is right for our company. What do we think is required in order to retain our key talent for this transaction, and then make a decision. So maybe Margaret and Dan, what do you see there?
I think that's oh, go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a good summary.
The change of control, once you're in it, then it's a little different in that there's you sort of start with a bottoms-up approach based on the specifics of the deal. And so management's usually kind of working on that piece of it. And then we've got to get a balance, right, of some sense of how this might play out in terms of total cost. And that's where the consultants come in by providing some, framework for that, as well as, and then the board ultimately decides as to the action steps that need to be taken here. So, Margaret, did you want to cover this piece as well?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a kind of a good segue from those questions as well. So the question for target boards is when when a change in control is imminent, are the plans and programs that are already established, are they going to hold senior leadership and key talent through the entire M&A process as needed? The strength of any program is can be very heavily impacted by the type and components of the change in control benefits. For example, single trigger benefits versus double trigger benefits, and frankly, the type of transaction involved as well. So if it's a transaction in which executives are expected to be terminated post-closing, or if they are needed for post-deal, all those factors will influence whether or not the current programs are adequate. A retention program itself is designed to help the business be delivered in the form and value that is expected by both the sellers and the buyers. The company will want to motivate employees to stay and do the job required and the plans should be targeted to apply to the employees that provide the most value and that are, frankly, at the most at risk of leaving. Next slide.
So, kind of moving from the philosophical, right, it's saying, well, who's high at risk and who's, high value to the organization, who might be low value, low risk. I mean, tactically, what ultimately happens, right, is that management develops a grid of sort of employees and employee groups. And so we sort of laid one out here as sort of an illustration where we've included whether or not somebody has an agreement or whether they're participating in the equity, whether they're a new hire, which has some implications to it, whether they are at risk as it relates to the transaction, or whether they perceive themselves to be at risk. Right? Most employees think of themselves as being at risk, even though they may not. And then, whether or not it's a flight risk and how impactful that is to the company. And from a company's perspective, thinking about it over a timeline, right? We have to retain this individual up to the close. We have to retain them 6 months after. We have to retain them 12 months after. And this is all from the seller's perspective, right? The buyer can choose to do something different if they view that they have, that the current arrangements aren't adequate from their standpoint. But from the seller's, perspective, this is really about deciding whether or not we need to make changes to what we've got outstanding. And so we sort of outlined this here, right, where in this illustration, the CEO is well covered with an agreement and equity, so no changes are required. The NEO in this example is a new hire, and so they may have an agreement, which we thought would cover them, but because of the rules under 280G, the payments that were expected might get scaled back quite a bit. And so this is a case where somebody might, we might be using one of our other tools, right? We might do some mitigation action on 280G. We might have a retention component in there. We might, add a non-compete to enhance that benefit. And then we have two folks that are sort of BU management, right? And the first one is at risk for, being terminated and perceives themselves to be, and high value to the organization. And in that case, that might be a great place for a retention bonus to be put in place. For the second BU, we've, in this illustration, right, we've said basically that they're not really at risk, although they might perceive themselves to be at risk. In which case, perhaps an enhanced severance program, is sufficient because we don't necessarily think that they are, that they're as critical to retain, perhaps. And then the last one is somebody that's maybe doing the deal support, where, whether they stay or whether they not stay with the organization, they're going to be putting a lot of effort in because there's a fair amount of work that needs to be done in a short period of time. And so, we want to encourage that, positive behavior. And so maybe it's a spot bonus that occurs, a small bonus, or sort of the enhanced severance would kind of cover the individuals in that circumstance.
Okay, so when companies decide they have some exposure and management comes with some ideas about retention transaction bonuses, there's always a question as to, okay, how are the costs in comparison to the deal value? And if you've been in enough deals, you probably have heard a 3% rule as something to be mindful of when assessing whether ChangeinControl payments might be just too high. This 3% data point is really it's lore. Unfortunately, there really isn't a significant amount of detail on what the 3% is meant to apply to. For example, like what components go into the numerator? Should it cover all ChangeinControl benefits in the entire company, including acceleration of equity? Or does it cover just NEO ChangeinControl benefits? Does it cover executive officers, senior management? There just really is no consensus. And on the denominator side, okay, what should that be? Should that be the equity transaction value? Should it be book value? which means it would be inclusive of the debt. There really, again, is no consensus, and if you try to pinpoint or pin down somebody, an M&A professional, about this particular lore that they've all heard, everybody has different ideas about what the rule of thumb means. So we tried to make some sense of the lore, and we have been collecting data on change in control payments for executive officers in real transactions through our sister company, Main Data Group. Main Data and Pearl Meyer have reviewed over 750 transactions since 2016 from companies that have been going through transactions and were required to submit their change in control payments to a say on golden parachute advisory vote. In our analysis, we took into consideration all the change in control payments that were disclosed, and we looked at that as the total payments as a percentage of the transaction equity value, as this is sort of reflects the dilution to shareholders in a deal, so we think that is kind of the best thing to look at. It's also how the shareholder advisory services firms tend to look at it when they determine their vote recommendations for the say on golden parachute voting. There's always variation by industry and deal size. The data above in the slide reflects the aggregate percentages that are reflected in all the deals in the database. But what we found is that the 3%, the lore is really not a bad estimate under certain circumstances. It roughly corresponds to the median of deals between the 100 million equity and $1 billion of equity. But you can see that the rule of thumb is really less useful in the larger deals and in the smaller deals. What this slide really shows is that the percentage is highly dependent upon the size of the transaction. So that 3% is not that useful for the very small deals. The percentages are higher in the smaller deal and much lower in the larger deals.
Right, and I think, I mean, this gets back to Frank's point as to what are we, what should the board, the seller's board, approve if there are suggestions for making changes? And so, you kind of compile what your changes are, how that applies to your executive officers, and then how maybe this is used as a tool to essentially assess whether or not that's considered reasonable or not. And if, we're well within kind of the bounds, then the sellers are probably not going to have an objection to that. If we're way above that amount, then the question is, does the seller view that as not effective, use of compensation, and therefore the price should be lower, in this particular deal? So that's pretty high, pretty critical issue for most boards to deal with. And for our purposes here, the NEOs is this is really all the executive officers named within the proxy for that particular transaction. So there are, folks that are the named executive officers in the say on golden parachute table, but there's other executive officers which also have to be listed. And so to the extent that that information was provided, then we've included it here.
But Dan, named executive officer, isn't it a term which includes a CEO and CFO and the next three highest paid executives? Are you saying there's a different
correct.
definition?
We probably could have said that this was executive officers instead of named executive officers for purposes of the slide. But this really covers sort of the executive officers, so that it would show up in the say on golden parachute disclosure. Not saying golden parachute disclosure.
Has nothing to do necessarily with named executive officers, but they are typically included, or more likely to be included.
They are included. That's correct.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the next, sort of topic then that comes up is sort of retention and transaction bonuses, right? And, most companies are familiar with having retention bonuses in place. They put them, sort of on an ad hoc basis for any number of issues on an ongoing basis. But what we're really talking about here is as it relates to a retention, bonus plan put in place due to the fact that we're, expected to undergo a change of control. And I think most, our experiences is that the vast majority of companies do provide for some sort of retention, bonus plan as it relates to a change of control. What's provided in the, the proxy disclosure in the event of a transaction is whether or not named executive officers are included in those retention or sort of transaction bonuses, as well as, sometimes they will also include kind of what the total pool is. And so when we look at this, just again, this is sort of all size companies, all industries, so there's a lot of variation, sort of within, a particular industry or size. But roughly speaking, about a third of the time, 30%, would institute a retention or transaction bonus, and it would be inclusive of where there's a executive officer that's included. And so I think it's reasonable for committees and boards to assess whether there's utility in having a retention plan or a transaction bonus put in place. But obviously, it's the facts and circumstances will drive this as to whether we think there's actually a substantive need to put this in place. And then, we've got we split them out between transaction retention. There's fewer transaction, incentive plans than there are retention bonus plans. And then, one of the next questions would be is, what amount should we be looking at here? And I think it's, while it's, I guess, a couple points. One is that the retention plans are, more common than the transaction. The second is that the retention amounts are usually higher than what the transaction bonus amounts are, although there are, some circumstances where, the transaction bonus amounts kind of rival what the retention plans are, which I think ultimately makes some sense because, what companies and buyers buyers are looking for is being able to retain those individuals sort of to the transaction and then beyond, so that they'll have a chance to assess the individuals and whether or not they want to continue employment for those individuals. So the retention plans tend to offer that flexibility, whereas a transaction bonus means that they have to move a little quicker on that. And so what we've done here is we've sort of looked at retention and transaction bonuses combined. Again, this is kind of the whole swath of companies, large and small. And we eliminated, sort of the smaller, one-off retention or transaction bonuses for a particular executive officers. So this is a summary of the total retention or transaction bonuses by company. And if a company included a pool that might have included executive officers or might have excluded them, that's also included in this. And what we see is that, over sort of this broad group, there's quite a bit of variability in terms of what this is as a percentage of the transaction value. So anywhere from, 0.1, 0.15% all the way up to, 0.7 or 0.75% of the deal would be fairly typical. But obviously it depends on the circumstances of the company. And I think what we've seen is that, and not unexpectedly, if a company has a significant amount of in-the-money value on the equity, there's a lot less need for a retention or transaction bonus certainly at the senior officer level. And, vice versa, if this is more of a distressed sale and there's not much equity, then, there might be, some advantage to putting in these plans to make sure that even at that price, that the company is getting, the buyer is getting what it is expected to get, and the seller is delivering on that. And then we've got just one, I think, additional slide as it relates to this, which is talking a little bit about how does this all kind of pull together when you think about, total payments or potential payments, right? And the cash is going to be potential because it requires determination of the individual. The equity is mostly going to be accelerated on the change of control, but not always. And then there's other components. We talked a little bit about retirement benefits in there, which, in this case fits into the other category. There might be some perquisites that are, provided for in the event of a change of control. There might be 280G payments associated with this. So all those components are sort of, potential payments to the executive officer. And so what we've done here is we've looked at sort of the distribution for executive officers of what that sort of pay mix looks like, and we broke it out by kind of the size of the business. And as you might anticipate, with deal sizes which are on the right, which is $1 to $10 billion, versus those in the smaller category, which would be 100 to 500 million in deal size, that for larger companies, equity is the driver behind what those potential payments really look like. Cash severance is the second major component to it. Whereas with smaller companies, by its nature, where executives are not receiving as much equity and they're not receiving the same amount, relative to their cash compensation, that the cash severance tends to be a pretty big and substantial portion of what the potential payments are, and the equity would then be kind of the secondary component there.
This slide covers 280G, and 280G can significantly erode the change in control benefits that we've just outlined. If the golden parachute liabilities under IRC Section 280G are triggered, the change in control benefits can be significantly eroded. Now, the typical plan provisions for 280G excise taxes, the most common approaches we find for CEOs and NEOs now is what's known as the best after tax approach. This provision provides for a reduction of the parachute payments to the safe harbor if the executive is better off on an after-tax basis by doing that. If not, the executive receives all the parachute payments, pays the associated income and excise taxes on unreduced payments. By the way, we have in the appendix detail on 280G, so we're presuming some knowledge of 280G for everyone, but if you're a little confused, you can go back to the appendix and look at the rules. The next most common approach after best after tax is actually being silent on the treatment of excise taxes. The gross up was the more prevalent in sort of past decades. That's pretty much dwindling. We'd expect that most of those gross ups that were being reported, and by the way, this is reporting from the annual disclosures as to what the change in control agreements provide. We expect that those gross ups are legacy gross ups. There are very few scale backs reported. Hard scale backs, meaning you cut back to the safe harbor no matter what. If you're over the safe harbor, we find very few of those as well. At this level, this reports, again, only the named executive officers, so it is at the top level. We see scale backs more often applied to the lower tier executives. We'll move to the next slide, Dan. So in our Say on Golden Parachute research, the research of the SOGP filings, we do find 280G being discussed in the Say on Golden Parachute disclosures. We found that about 15% of the companies that disclosed some sort of 280G mitigation being allowed by target companies to take. We think that prevalence is probably low, and that it's only disclosed if it's needed, or, in practicality, we find that the actual prevalence of 280G mitigation is a bit higher. we find it's a common practice in the deals that we've worked on. On the slide, we've mentioned some of the more common mitigation actions that are reported by the companies. The most common one being, increase base amounts by accelerating payments. That's like acceleration of a bonus, time-vested restricted stock, or performance units, provided there is no problem with acceleration under 409A. We're not going to cover all the types of mitigating actions because some of these get kind of technical and would take up a lot of your time in trying to understand. So let's move on to the next slide. Dan, I think what needs to be mentioned, because it's been so talked about on the, in the press and by M&A practitioners, is the concept of implementing a new gross up at the last minute or immediately kind of prior to the transaction or as a result of the transaction. While this does happen, certainly does happen, it appears to be a minority practice. In the transactions that we reviewed, it was less than 5% of the companies reported having a new 280G gross up. And the disclosures about why those new gross ups had been implemented are pretty sparse. Mostly there was no rationale provided, but some did cite retention concerns or the fact that the tax consequences to the particular executive officer that received the benefit was so onerous in relation to the value that had been created in the deal. So as you might expect, however, new gross ups, implementing those immediately prior to a transaction almost always results in a failed say on golden parachute vote. Next
right.
slide.
And I think we've got a couple of slides here. One is just as it relates to things that we need to think about, from a board's perspective, and I think you can kind of go through that. Big issue is back of the envelope with the 280G calculations, because 280G is very specific, and a dollar difference, makes a very big outcome change in terms of what that is. So that's something that should be considered, as having somebody outside the company review that. And then we've got a page here that you can review later on the M&A related topics and how this relates to the board and when the board and the comp committee should be assessing these items. But I think now we should turn over to Frank and see if we have any questions.
Yes, we have. Thanks, Dan. We have a couple of questions. The first one, I think I can address myself. So one question was, with the current economic environment where many companies struggle financially, how these deals get done. And well, I give you my point of view. If you are a seller, what are you selling? You're selling a brand. You're selling manufacturing capabilities. You're selling access to customers, but you also sell management, people who make this happen. And if you want to sell a company and you want to make sure it goes through, you want to make sure that you can retain your key executives in the interest of the buyer. And for the buyer, it's the same thing. Certainly a change in control agreement makes a deal more expensive for the buyer. But when you look around at what kind of multiples are being paid today, and also if you look at the percent of the transaction value, which Margaret and Dan discussed earlier, it's a small amount in comparison to the transaction value. So I would say the current economic environment does not negatively impact the amount or the existence for change of control agreement. Let me ask the next question to Margaret and Dan, and that's a question regarding, are there any downsides for changing control agreements? We just talked about it increases the cost of the deal, but are there any other downsides of a change in control agreements you can think of, or maybe disputes afterwards?
Well, I mean, I guess the biggest downside potentially, right, is if we have a very lucrative change in control agreement relative to what somebody's compensation is. And so that creates an environment where management is seeking to sell the company sort of irregardless. I mean, that's certainly one. I think the broader issue with changing, and you know, we've already talked about the magnitude, right? So if we have if it's too expensive, then if the buyer's looking at this and it's too employee friendly, then the buyer's not buying the people that they think they're buying, and that becomes a deal, right? Potentially a deal breaker on this. Ultimately, you know, I think the bigger issue with ChangeinControl is that it's put in place, and it's reasonable to put it in place kind of with an expectation, you know, that this will pay out at, you know, whatever was intended by the committee. But then we get into a real deal, and the deal's just very different. And so it doesn't necessarily work as well as we would like, and we have to make adjustments for it.
Yeah, makes sense. So there's another question I can handle. Does the board typically work with a consultant, or is it the head of a compensation committee, or is it a CHRO? And who ultimately reviews, you know, the approval of a ChangeinControl agreement? So as a board member, I can tell you, typically the board has their own management, their own compensation consultant. And when you talk about the size of the ChangeinControl agreements, it's typically the consultant who gives a benchmarking and compares to peers and presents this to the compensation committee, not just to the head of compensation committee or not to the CHRO, to the CEO. It's typically the compensation committee. And that's who makes a proposal then to the board, and then the board approves it as part of the overall compensation package for the executives. All right, so I think we can go with this. So maybe one of the last questions, Margaret and Dan, is what are some of the major, what was some of the advice you would give a company or board, maybe a board, when it comes to putting a ChangeinControl agreement in place? What are some of the key things they should watch out for? First of all, should they have one, or should they not have one, even if there's no deal on the horizon? And then second, what are some of the things you really want to watch out for as a board?
Well, I think that there's, you know, from a board's perspective, the first and foremost is it competitive and necessary, right, in a sort of a ongoing basis. And as we see here, that it's, you know, at least in sort of public companies, it's very common to have. So I think that there's certainly rationale for doing it. Now, what we would suggest is that you do use, you know, kind of what the competitive framework looks like. And as we see, one of the areas is whether or not it's a single trigger payout or only contingent on the ChangeinControl, and that's particularly for severance. The second area that's sort of a, you know, has become less of an issue at this point is the gross-up provision, because the institutional investors have found that to be very problematic and have, I think, successfully, you know, lobbied against that. But obviously, you know, there are going to be individuals that will ask for those things, particularly those individuals that have been through deals and have been burned by the provisions of the agreement, where they didn't get what they expected they were going to get in the transaction itself. And,
so I'm afraid,
you know,
that has to be it, because we are at the end of the hour, and I think I need to turn it back to Sienna.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I'd like to remind the audience that, as we mentioned earlier, we do have several appendix slides in this deck and a couple of slides that we skipped over that you saw that have that have additional information and data that we didn't cover during the presentation, particularly focusing on key takeaways and 280G. So I'd like to encourage you all to download the slide deck. You can do so either through the additional resources box on your webinar console, on Pearl Meyer's website, or from NACD's webinar archives, and we will send a follow-up email to all attendees when the archive is available.